The first speaker is Professor Alan Reilly, and he is the Chief Exec of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. And I'm also very happy to say that he is Chairman of UFIC's Scientific Advisory Board as well. So, Alan, key challenges for future food-related risk communication. What have we learnt from the horsemeat incident?
Thank you very much, Joe. And first of all, let me say thank you to the organisers for inviting me here this afternoon to talk to you. One of the things about the horsemeat incident is we say it wasn't a food safety issue. We were that far away from it being a food safety issue. It wasn't a food safety issue by design, it was pure luck. And it could have been a massive food safety issue. But I think the key challenge for me just now, I think, is keeping you all awake. And hopefully I'm going to be able to do that. But yes, looking back on what did we learn, I think one of the things about this particular incident is it started very quietly. I was on the telephone in my office on a Tuesday morning, and somebody put this sticker in front of me. Daily Mail knows something is going to break on horsemeat. Call Jane. Jane is our press officer. By the time I got off the phone, there were 13 other journalists looking for the story. And I thought to myself, we hadn't got a press release. We had nothing, but we had the bones of a report. But we didn't have a press release. We didn't have really anything to go. So my first thought was, look, let's put out a holding statement. So I very quickly wrote a holding statement, and our press people looked at it and said, that's not going to work. You'll be crucified. And it was literally, if we don't go out with something, the journalists are going to make it up. And let me say, listening to the previous session, that is a perception from my side of the fence sometimes, that the perception would be, don't spoil a good story with the facts. And, in a lot of cases, that's how it is. Well, months later, it was still going on. And one of the things about this particular incident is that, when could we turn it off? Was there any way that we could turn that off? It was like really a tsunami of horse manure coming down the track at us. We could not, really coping with the level of the intensity of the media pressure. This is what it was really like. How do we stop it? And we couldn't. The horse had run out of the stable and it was well on its way, let me tell you. What actually happened, very quickly for people who don't know, we started off doing a survey in November of last year. It was on the authenticity of beef products on the Irish market. We do authenticity studies all the time. We use DNA techniques to look at things like the authenticity of fish, which is wrapped in batter, the authenticity of smoked versus wild salmon and so on. So it's not unusual for us to do this type of study. When it came to looking at what we would look at, we said, well, if we look at meat products, beef products, what type of products do we look at? And the answer was products that consumers don't know what they're buying. There's no point in looking at the authenticity of a piece of steak, because everybody can see that it's a piece of steak. It was products that would be masked, something like a shepherd's pie. Will have a layer of potato on top. You won't know what's inside it. The lasagna will have lasagna sitting on top. You're not going to know what's inside it. A burger is going to be minced up. You're really not going to know what type of species and so. So that was the driving force for us looking at these type of products. The cost of beef had gone through the roof in Europe over the last 2.5 years. So we said, well, maybe people are trying to substitute beef with something else. What would they be looking at? Pork, very cheap, in comparison to beef. Horsemeat, even cheaper still. So all of these factors, if you like to call it, were what we put together and said, well, let's look at the following products. And that's really what happened. We found it, and I got the results on a Friday evening, about half past 5. For the weekend, I went home and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to present this? And trying to conjure up something to go out with, and who are we going to go with? Like, we were going out nearly to the Stry the reputation of Ireland with respect to beef products. That's how I was looking at it. At this stage, we had no idea the wider dimensions of what was going on. And trying to figure out our results and trying to rationalize the type of results that we had was very, very difficult because we just didn't know what was going on. Now I can look back and say exactly, we know now what was going on. At the time it was very difficult. But it went very quickly. We spread the beef burgers that were produced in Ireland were on the market in the UK. The UK very rapidly started to test, and they confirmed that the problem was somewhat wider. Within probably 8 days, the problem had spread right across Europe. And not alone across Europe, but products were exported as far afield as Asia, the Caribbean, Russia, and so on. And when the European Commission did an EU-wide survey for between about mid-March and April, 10% of all the beef products that were tested in France had more than 1% horse meat. 14% of the beef products on sale in Greece had more than 1% horse meat. And the overall it was something around a little under 5% of the total had more than 1% horse meat. And some of those products had 100% horse meat. So that's more or less, a very, very, very quick synopsis of what we found. The one thing that I did learn about this is that the next food crisis is only a bite away. And really, if you were to say, if there's a take-home message, is that there's something else coming down the track that we don't know about at the present moment. And do we have the intelligence to actually know what it is? When I say the intelligence, how do we gather data that will actually leave us in a better position now that we can at least have advance warning of what's going on? It's quite a difficult one. And I do remember the first meeting of the FoodRisC group back in 2009. It was in UFIC, and we were talking about, well, it's a pity we didn't start the project a year ago because we would have had data from, the dioxin crisis in Ireland and so on. We would say, well, we have to do a retrospective study and so on. And at the time, I remember saying, look, don't worry, we'll have another crisis. And we say we've had two major crises this year, one in Europe and one in New Zealand. They're always going to be there. The key issue about crises is, are we prepared? And that is really key. Is Europe prepared to face another horse meat incident or some similar type of incident? Like, really, the message here is you have to have robust systems in place. You're never going to get rid of crises. They're always going to be around. You just have to have systems in place that can actually deal with the crises as they come along. The horse meat scandal wasn't just about food safety. It was really about emotions. And it was about fear. Consumers were afraid. Initially, they had lost trust. What else are we feeding our children? What else is in food that we don't know about? Does food really come that far, from far afield to my table? They ended up being terribly angry. Politicians were seriously concerned, and if you just look back at what happened, that the European Parliament had a debate for about 2.5 hours one morning. Lots of concern. Many other politicians in different European countries were voicing their concern. The media were afraid of not getting a story. And really, the pressure on the Food Safety Authority of Ireland in terms of the media pressure, I found journalists everybody wanted an angle for themselves. And the more, the bigger the headline and the more scary the headline, I think that's where people were, and the investigative journalist. I know the investigative journalist has a real role to play, but trying to put the facts, and the plain and simple facts, I know we were talking about this in the last session, but just putting the plain and simple facts isn't enough sometimes. There's more required. The stress on regulators, afraid of getting it wrong. And if you look at what happened in New Zealand a couple of weeks back, they recalled the product because of Clostridium botulinum. A few weeks later, they came out and said it wasn't Clostridium botulinum at all. It was Clostridium sporogenes. So suddenly, somebody got it wrong someplace, and then that became the story. Scientists under pressure with the results, and certainly one of the real take-home messages for anybody, if you're going to do this type of a study, and if you're going to go out with it in the public domain, you better have the science as sound as anything, because if you don't, you'll be ripped to shreds, and that's really we were talking about scientists already and the role of scientists. Checking, rechecking, validating, discussing, interpreting results before you go out with them is really key. Businesses afraid of losing customers, and there are many brands involved. Competitive advantage being undermined, and lastly, greed. Plenty of food fraud opportunities. So I mean, that would be sort of the horsemeat scandal in a nutshell. Within the first few hours, the regulators, manufacturers, politicians, and media, went from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in just a heartbeat. By that Monday morning, by the time we had talked to one or two of the manufacturers and were trying to talk to retailers, everything had ramped up so fast it was untrue. And trying to, again, communicate in that type of environment is difficult. And really, for the first couple of days, it was nearly total turmoil with respect to communication. It was like you were being swallowed up in a vortex. Sleeping, you could forget about going home. It didn't happen. And a lot of people were under, a lot of stress. And everybody wanted this thing fixed instantly. And our job was to stop the spin. And we did over time. But, it's still, the incident is still going on. Just this morning, I'm liaising with people in the UK with respect to one of the evaluation reports. Yesterday morning, I did an interview with somebody who's writing a story, a journalist who's writing a story. So it hasn't really gone away. It's still bubbling away in the background. And I think from a communication point of view, and trying to keep consistently that level of intensity with a story is difficult. I think one very important lesson in terms of communication was fact and fiction ran neck and neck for months. And really, it taught us a few lessons with respect to communication. When we communicate, we would communicate broadly with 4 different audiences. We would communicate with consumers. We would communicate with regulators. We have 33 different agencies in Ireland who implement some aspect of food control. We communicate with them all the time. We communicate with our colleagues in Brussels in the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, and we communicate with other food agencies across Europe and literally in other parts of the world as well. We communicate with industry through different fora and one-to-one and so on, and we communicate with politicians. The types of messages that we have, if you look back at previous food incidences, we would use things like press releases and media. We'd use the media to get our message out to consumers, and through the form of press releases and probably one-to-one discussions with journalists. And I think the presentation about the 7 key points, get to know journalists. I would agree really with that. You need to build up that relationship with journalists in advance of trying to communicate this type of an incident. But when it comes to communicating with journalists globally, as we had to do in this case, we didn't know who we were talking to. So it's not that easy. With regulators, with food incident reports and the Rapid Alert Network and so on. With industry, we would send out alerts to industry all the time, and the trade press. We have a system of dialoguing with industry with respect to food incidences, and politicians with briefings and so on. What happened here with our the horsemeat incident, that Twitter was, it was really, for the first time, Twitter was up and running to an extent that really it nearly took over. I didn't know what trending meant on Twitter until somebody showed me. And I was watching a slot machine. You know these slot machines, and they turn around, and we say it was going so fast, Twitter, and this was coming from different parts of the world, that I couldn't read what the messages that Twitter was. There was so many different messages coming through on Twitter. And then there's a whole lot of other friends of Twitter. There's so many of them. And I think somebody said, the people under 30, this is how they're communicating. For sure, I think one of the messages is, this is going to be the communication of the future. And I don't think there's any question about that. But really, the power of social networking, by just pressing one button, you can disseminate truth and lies, millions will know in seconds. And we haven't had that type of system of communication, and a lot of people have mentioned this in the previous communications. This is something new from this crisis. It's always morning someplace in the world. And if you look at what was happening, the story went global, and literally in every time zone, people woke up and the main item on the news was horsemeat. And the global press were coming to the Food Safety Authority for information. And if you look at what's happened in New Zealand in the last 2 weeks, I watched this happening live, the story growing. It started in New Zealand, an hour later it was Hong Kong, 5 hours later the story was in Europe with the European press, then it went to the States probably something like 10 hours later. And this is the way the story goes. Like, there's no really free space. It's when you're dealing with a global media and a global food scare, this is what you're dealing with. You're feeding a media that, its appetite is huge. And what we found during this particular incident was that the conventional media just fed off and feeding into social media. They were just going neck and neck. You're trying to distinguish between them. Every newspaper has its own website. There's blogs on the websites. They're taking stories from other websites, and everybody's trying to attract the consumers into their website. So the headlines get more stark, and this is frightening, because what I was looking at was our industry going down the tube as people created more and more headlines. Really serious stuff. This has never happened to us before, that we had 500% more calls from journalists than we had from consumers during the first 3 months of the horsemeat crisis. And consumers were calling us up and telling us jokes, but the journalists wanted stories, and each one wanted a different angle on the story. When are your next results coming? What does it mean? How much percent horsemeat have you got in that? It was like you're trying to manage a food crisis in the public domain is not easy. What I found is you will be held accountable for government committees, both in Ireland, and the communication here was quite serious. In the UK also, different government committees. Specific ministers will hold you accountable for what you did, for what you said, for what the media think you said, and what you didn't say at all. So that's really the position you're in as far as communication is concerned. We have media experts, and in the first week of this crisis, surely, Minister, Ireland Inc. has shot itself in the foot by declaring the horse meat fine and there's no health risk. And in the first week, the media actually turned, when it came to communication, they turned on the Food Safety Authority and said, look, why have you done this? Why did you do this study? Why have you put those results out? No food safety risk. What's the meaning of less than 1% DNA, equine DNA in a burger? What type of methods are you using? And you're trying to communicate complex messages. We're trying to talk about, we're using mitochondrial DNA. We're using nuclear DNA to do analysis. And, again, the discussion at the last session was on, science and science journalists and so on. Trying to interpret all of that, very, very complex science, was really difficult to get the messages out. Lessons how not to communicate. This is the chief executive of one of the major retailers. He went on the BBC national TV and he said, there's no horse meat in my products. The interviewer said, look, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland has found horse meat in your products. And his comment was, well, isn't that the Irish? The next day he apologized for the remark because what he found was a few million consumers that were Irish that were buying his products. And suddenly he was in a position. The message here to learn from this incident and communication is make sure you have expert advice if you're going out to do crisis communication. You don't do crisis communication on the hoof. A couple of weeks back, the Advertising Standards Authority looked at the ads that Iceland had put out, and they essentially said, look, they denigrated the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, but very few people would actually have read that angle into the communication. What we have learned is you need a strong political voice when you're in the middle of this type of a crisis. And we were fortunate that Ireland had the European presidency during the first 6 months of this year, and our Minister for Agriculture, he really took the lead, and he took, quite good advice. And at European level, the incident was communicated by the Commission, and there's a 5-point plan to make sure this doesn't happen again. I won't go into the details, but really, if you can have, a spokesperson who is, articulate, knowledgeable, in the right position at the right time, I think is certainly a lesson that I have learned with this one. Well, look, if you can't beat them, you should join them. And really, when it comes to some of these social media channels, I think we have to recognise the new ways of communication. We have to be, literally, we have to be on the pitch. We have to have developed our own in-house expertise. For regulators, we certainly need to have our own Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, and so on. And certainly the Food Safety Authority of Ireland has developed these over the last few years. And it's the first time during the horse meat crisis that we actually use them to their full potential. You need to monitor the food message traffic, and this has been said before, but certainly that is something that you should be doing, is to monitor what's going on in the social media. Participate and contribute at all levels. Communicate. Don't allow that political vacuum, the communication vacuum to develop, otherwise somebody's going to fill it, and you mightn't be terribly happy with what it's being filled with. And drive messages through treats. We were using social media to get people onto our webpage where all the factual information was. And that's really the strategy that we would have used. And planned activity levels. We have procedures in place, we have SOPs, the whole lot for this form of new communication. The most important ingredient is trust. And I think this was lost by consumers, in processed meat products right across Europe. And we talked about trust, and certainly if you are communicating as a government agency and consumers have trust in you, they will believe what you're actually saying. And certainly, the track record that I think we have, since the beginning of the year and before, that people were believing the messages that we were giving out, which was very, very useful. Thank you very much for listening.